As the nation pushes for police reforms, what happened to the lone police department investigation started by the DOJ? NBC News Justice correspondent Julia Ainsley has some answers here. And Julia, a Justice Department official told NBC News the one investigation opened under President Trump is still going 3 years later with no results. Tell us about this. What is going on here?
That's right. So it's actually very rare and very difficult for the Justice Department to open one of these investigations in this Justice Department for a number of reasons. One is that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions raised the bar. He said that unlike prior administrations, they were able to do full-scale reviews of a police department. That's not looking at one policeman and saying whether or not one incident was criminal, but looking at the broad culture, being able to take a police department like Minneapolis and say, look, there are some patterns or practices here that seem like they use excessive use of force, that there is a racial bias, things like that. They used to be able to do that. Jeff Sessions raised the bar on that. He said that basically the Justice Department shouldn't go that far, that that's federal overreach and there should allow local and state police departments to be sovereign. Instead, only one investigation actually rose to that level, and it is still ongoing. And it's easy to see why it was raised to that level, Allison, but it's not easy to see why there haven't been any conclusions. Basically, what happened is in Springfield, Massachusetts, there was an incident where two police officers had a cop car stolen. They chased down the people who were suspected of stealing this car, found out it was a group of teenagers, and seemingly out of embarrassment, the officers allegedly took these boys who were teenagers, told them that they would plant evidence on them, such as drugs, to keep them from telling the truth. They said that they threatened to kill them. One was bitten with a police dog. They told the other boys they would also be subject to the police dog and bitten if they didn't come clean and say things that frankly weren't true. They were threatened during this interrogation, and as minors, they weren't able to see their parents. During the criminal investigation of those officers, it came to light that there was a whole culture at Springfield, Massachusetts police headquarters where there was drinking on the job. They even had a vending machine where they took out the soda, replaced it with beer. They would drink sometimes on duty.
Oh my God.
In fact, it came to light that during that incident I described, some of the officers had been inebriated. There was just, I could go on with the number of violations, not only in this one incident,
wow,
but through all of these police officers who had serious complaints. So the Justice Department decided to open one of those broad cultural investigations on Springfield, Massachusetts police, but that was in spring of 2018. Here we are in summer of 2020, and there has been nothing. We're not even able to see who they've interviewed or what has happened. And just to give you an idea of how long these things usually take, the Obama administration opened one of these investigations into Chicago. They did 340 interviews, and they found out within a year, they listed all of the problems, and they went to a judge, and they came to an agreement of how Chicago was going to change their culture. That's for a city like Chicago, 340 interviews. And yet we're in the third year in a town like Springfield, Massachusetts, with these seemingly pretty obvious violations, and nothing has been found.
Wow. I mean, Julia, just to put this in context even further, if you could tell us a little bit more about the differences between what's going on now in the Obama administration. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Obama administration's DOJ launched 25 of these types of investigations?
Yeah, that's right. And the White House, the Bush administration launched 12. It's not like this was just unheard of under Republican administrations. This is a tool that was put into place after the Rodney King trial in LA that we know incited lots of protest and violence in LA because of that decision. Basically, the Justice Department after that was given this tool that if they couldn't go after individual police, if that wasn't enough, that they could look at the broad culture. It's called a pattern or practice investigation. And that was done 25 times in the Obama administration. It was a huge tool for them to be able to bring justice in Ferguson, Missouri, after those officers were not criminalized on state charges, the Justice Department was able to go in and say, look, let's look at the entire fabric of the city, the way they might use debtors' prisons, of the way a police force is targeting who they want to stop at a routine traffic stop. Why are they choosing certain people? They can look at data. They bring in policing experts. They do interviews. They look at the whole community. It's a very broad sweep. And then they're able, usually through negotiations with the police department, to come to an agreement. And a lot of times that will include installing an independent monitor, like one that they had in LA for almost 12 years. But Jeff Sessions decided that that was going too far, and he raised the bar on what that could mean. Now the question is, what's going on in Springfield? If you can only open this one investigation, why haven't we had answers? And should we be asking ourselves, should this tool be used in a place like Minneapolis after what happened to George Floyd?
A lot of questions there. Julia, before I let you go, when I have our justice correspondent here, I have to ask a question about John Bolton's book. What is the latest on the Justice Department's efforts to block its release?
Well, we're still waiting to hear what has been done. We know that there's this big up in the air over what is classified, because essentially the president can decide to classify anything. It seems that the best tool that they may have, because this book is already out there, it's in the hands of many reporters. I'm on my way to pick up the book as soon as we're done with this interview, Allison. Ooh. I would say that one thing they could do is keep money from going to John Bolton. That may be their best course of action here, and it's looking like that could be a lot of money, but we still have to see how this plays out.
All right, Julia, I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you got the book. I can't wait to hear more from you about it next week once you're done. Thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.